everybody, welcome back to Rain and Pours. I'm Mitch, and today I'm doing some resin work on some coasters that I've had sitting around for a little while now, a couple of months at least. I've had this idea in my head, I've given it a couple of goes, and I'm ready to show you all what I've been thinking of. So let's go down onto the surface and I'll tell you what that idea is. Okay, so here I have a cutting mat, and I've got a cutting mat for a good reason. So the idea I've had in my head was to use transparent overhead sheets with ink printed on them to create a silhouette on top of some coasters. So I'm going to put my gloves on because I've already prepared all of my coasters. I've wiped them down with isopropyl alcohol and made sure that they're all nice and clean. And I did this before with another pair of gloves. So if you haven't seen my resin process, please check that out. It's called Resin Time. That's on my channel. And the coasters I have today are these ones. So what I've done is I've done the Sheleeart Bloom swipe over these coasters, but what makes these really special is the background is made with TLP, Constellation and Nightfall, but the top half is made with chameleon pigment. So I'm not sure if you can quite see that color change on the top, going from green to purple. I need a better light for this. But that top pigment is a chameleon color. Let me see if I can get that in a bit closer. So you can see at the top there, it's going from green to purple. Now, the idea I had with these is to make them look like the Aurora Borealis. So as I was experimenting with different colored pigments and different colored chameleon colors, I did some experiments. So I did some with my Northern Lights collection. I did some with Tripoli, and I've also got another set that I've used another chameleon pigment on. Now, I tried this before, and I've got a set of coasters sitting in my house with this idea on there, and I will show you what I am talking about. So I designed a file, and I have 12 coasters, so I'll need 2 sheets, with some silhouettes that I got from Google. Now, I've got some mountains, I've got some palm trees, and I've got some African tree. Now, the idea with these is to cut them into squares so that they're small enough to fit on the coaster, and then I embed that in the resin. And this works wonderfully, and because they are transparent, you don't see this, you just see the design. So, the way that I cut these up so that they fit onto the coaster is I've made these just slightly smaller than the inside edge of the top here. If they stick over the edge, your resin will fall over it and you'll end up with a raised section where that transparency is, so we don't want that. So this time around, I made them just slightly shorter, and you will see a little bit of the design underneath, but it's a small caveat for the benefits of this design, I guess. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut along the bottom of each of these designs, right underneath where the silhouette is. And I'm going to use a rotary cutter, because when you use a Stanley knife or a craft knife, it tends to snag on the plastic and you don't get a nice clean cut. It doesn't have to be 100% perfectly even. And my advice with the offcuts is to put them in a place where you can see them and they're not going to get caught on your table or anything like that. So I might actually go down this edge first and just line up. Can't do that because they're all different widths. Okay. So it'll have to be this way. So I'm going to cut these along the bottoms, and then I'll come back and show you how I cut the edges. Basically, you're just cutting these out, making sure that you're leaving enough of a gap. Now, the problem I have here is I didn't align these two, so I can't cut straight across the bottom. I'll have to double cut. Now, the important thing with this is you don't leave any black sitting at the top of this part of the cutout, because that will be visible on your coaster. So if you do have any of that, just use your ruler to trim that up slightly. I did leave just a little bit on here. I'm just going to take off a couple more millimeters. Like that. Because that's an offcut, I'm going to put it in a nice safe place. Alright, so now that I have this, you want to try and square up your sides. So with these craft mats, they're great because you can line up the straight edge of the transparency, if you can see it, with the edge of a square, and just roughly estimate where your ruler is. and slice that up. So it is important that you get these square, because even though you won't be able to see it on your coaster, if there are any edges that you've missed or they're slightly overhanging, the curved edges will hang over the sides. So let's just go through these. I'll cut up all these and I will come back once they're all cut. Now, something worth mentioning as well is when I design these shapes, I design them so that I could cut a little bit off the edges if I need to, so that they're centered in the middle of the design of the tile. And it's not going to look too obvious if I just trim off a little bit. Realistically, this particular design, this mountain, I could have made a little bit narrower. That should be fine. And every now and then I'm just going over with my designs, making sure that they fit nicely in the middle of my tile. Okay, and you notice I'm wearing gloves while doing this because these will eventually be going under resin. I do not want anything to be contaminating my designs. Now, they don't all have to be the same height. The height isn't necessarily as important as the width. Obviously, you do want to make sure that the height is never exceeding the top dimensions of your tile. So, for example, my tiles are 4 inches, so 10 centimeters. So I want to make sure that whatever design that I'm making is not taller than 10 centimeters and not wider than 10 centimeters. Now, because of the way that the tiles are, they actually bend down slightly at the top. So that means that the top here is not 10 centimeters. The bottom is, but the top is actually a little bit narrower. So I would say the top is maybe 9.6 millimeters. Sorry, 96 millimeters, which is 9.6 centimeters. So you have to take that into account when designing your artwork, and then also when you're cutting them out. This one, I can see that I've got to trim that up. Trim straight across the top here. And try and get things as nice and neat as possible in case you do see the transparency. Against a dark background, you should lose it completely. But if you do happen to see it, you want to trim as close to your design as possible so that it essentially becomes invisible. I wouldn't advise doing this on a lighter design. I'd only do it on a darker one, for the sole reason that the white will show the transparency a lot more than black will. Obviously, the smaller you can make your actual transparency, the easier it's going to be to fit in the center of the tile. So for example, and the hardest part is choosing which way this is going to display. Now, you can obviously see that's reflecting now, but once I've put the resin on, you won't even notice that. So this one might be this way. I might put it this way so it looks like it's coming out of the land on an angle, in which case I'd trim the sides up. So the options for this are limitless. The other thing I'm looking at doing is animal silhouettes. I think those are really popular. A lot of people would buy those. So deer, dolphins, whales, all that sort of thing. They could be really great ideas to use for this. Now, if you had a Cricut machine or a Silhouette Cameo or any of those machines that you could print and then chuck in your design and it would cut these out for you, they would be absolutely perfect for this application because you can get absolutely perfectly clean cuts out of your designs and you don't have to worry about edges overlapping anyway. I don't have one of those and I don't think I'd have much use for one of those, so I get these printed at Officeworks here in Australia. You can't print onto transparency paper with your normal home printer. You need a laser printer to do that, and Officeworks, that's the same thing that Officeworks uses. So getting them to do that for you is the best option if this is something that you want to explore or want to try. Okay, and they're all cut out. Now, something really fun with these is I leave these embedded in the resin. So there is a chance that you might see the transparency, but it most likely disappears. The other thing that I discovered is if you lay these on top of the resin and you happen to get the side, so you can tell which side has the ink on it. Let me see if I can focus here for you. So this side is just plastic. The other side is the side that has the ink on it. And I can tell that because this side is perfectly smooth and flat. And this side has the bubbles and the texture of the plastic on there. So I want to put the printed side facing up when I do this. But the other thing that I experimented with was one of the sheets didn't adhere properly. So I was able to peel all the resin off. But because the ink was facing down, the ink actually stuck to the resin on the surface. And there's no way that comes off. I've tried scrubbing that off and it's permanently stuck there. So the other thing you could do is just resin the surface, put these transfers on top, wait until it's cured, and then peel the plastic straight off. So that's another application you could do for this, which could be really awesome. And then what I would do is do a second coat just to seal that in. So I'm going to try two methods today. I'll try the first one, embedding it, and then I'll also try the peeling off method, and I'll show you how that goes. So I'm going to cut the rest of these out. I'll get set up, and then I'll come back and I'll show you the remaining process. Okay, so now I am mixing up my resin, and I use the Stone Coat countertop epoxy, and that's a 1-to-1 mixture, and I put the hardener in first. That's the clear part, and that just makes everything a lot easier to mix. Now, I'm not wearing my respirator at this second. I was just trying to talk with it on, and it's nearly impossible. So I'm going to mix this up, and I have had the resin sitting in a warm water bath for about 10-15 minutes before I started. So that's helping a lot of those bubbles come to the surface. It is quite thin, so I may have to wait a couple of minutes for this to thicken up, closer towards the end of the working time, maybe up to 10 minutes, just so it starts to gel, starts to thicken up a little bit, and it's not going to run completely off the surface of my coasters. So warming up the resin is a great way to thin it out, make it a lot easier to mix. However, that will make it a lot thinner, and it will run off the edge of your coasters a lot easier. And it may not be ideal for this, especially if your table isn't level. So yeah, I'm just going to wait for that to thicken up just a little bit. And once this is mixed, I will put my respirator back on to do the actual process. I'll show you how to do a couple of these, and then I'll put the respirator on. When working with resin, always be safe, always do the right thing, always wear the protective equipment. And if you have a reaction, just don't use it. So I've been mixing this for about 3 minutes. That's the recommended time on the packet, on the bottles, sorry. And you can see I don't have many bubbles in there at all. I know a lot of people have been saying lately that the Stone Coat is giving them lots of bubbles. It's all got to do with how you're mixing it. You can see I'm not whipping this. I'm very gently stirring it side to side, and the bubbles that I do have are minimal. Now that's because I've warmed this up slightly, it's not thick, and the bubbles can easily come to the surface. Okay, so my resin's mixed up. It's been sitting for about 5 minutes, and a lot of the bubbles have dissipated and come to the surface, which is great. Now what I'm going to do with my coasters is I'm going to move my designs. I've already positioned them, put them on the coasters that I want them to appear on in the way that I want them to look. Now I'm going to put a small dab of resin, and just a small dab, on the surface. And what this is going to do is going to adhere our silhouette to the coaster. And you want this so that you force all the bubbles out from underneath the transparency. Now I haven't mixed any glitter into this, and the reason for that is if you put glitter over the transparencies, it dulls the effectiveness of the transparency. So I've got a couple more over here, and all of the coasters I'll be resining in this batch, I don't want any glitter in. Generally over a black base I tend to put a little bit less glitter so that it's not so obvious. Now because it is so runny, I am going to keep it in the cup a little bit longer. Now with these I'm going to use my usual method and just smear this over the top. Now I'm not too fussed at this point about getting it on the sides, because like I said, this is just going to hold our silhouettes down. Now I am keeping an eye on that resin that is still in the cup. You never want to keep too much resin in the cup for a long time, because it can exotherm, which means that it will heat up and it will start to cure in the cup really, really quickly. So if I see that starting to happen, I'm going to take that out straight away and put it onto my coasters like I normally. So again, this is just a thin layer to adhere the silhouette to the coaster. You just want to make sure that it is everywhere that you want this silhouette to stick. More resin. Oh, too much. Again, you don't want to put too much on here. The next one. And the whole idea of this is you want to avoid applying a second layer once these have cured. So because you are adding a sheet in between each layer, you have to make sure that you're putting on about half as much per coaster, if that makes sense. So I'm doing essentially 2 layers of resin here, one on the base and one above on the transparency. And that means that my normal 8 to 10 milliliters of resin is now going to have to be split between those 2 layers. Resin is still fine. Okay, now a very important step here is to clean off your gloves or swap your gloves entirely. Just to save on gloves, I'm just going to wipe them off with some paper towel that I've got some 99% isopropyl alcohol. I just spray that on and wipe it off with the towel. Okay, now the important part here is to blast it with some heat to get rid of the bubbles. Okay, and so once you've done it with the torch, do it again with the heat gun, do it again with the blowtorch. To make sure there are no bubbles underneath these transparencies. Because if there are, there is no way for them to clear and come to the surface once we put the second layer on top. Now working quickly, I'm going to lay transparency flat and push down with my fingers. To make sure that all of the air bubbles come out. Should just be able to push them straight out. Sliding the image around a little bit does help to move any bubbles to off to the sides. So this is similar to when you would apply phone screen protector. Pushing down gently, forcing that resin out from underneath. Now the more resin that you can get out from underneath the transparency, the better that is going to be for your final result. One, because there's less likelihood that there are going to be bubbles in there, but two, straight on, getting too eager. Two, that means when you put your other layer of resin on top, it's less likely to stick out through the top layer of resin. It's nicely held down. Sorry if my head's in the way. You kind of do need to be directly over this while it's happening so you can see any of the bubbles. Really good lighting is incredibly important when you're doing this as well. Bubbles are much easier to get out from near the edges as well. So you want to try and push the bubbles out from the center. Some resin on my skin, I'm just going to quickly wipe that off. Now with my designs, I like to push them as close to the edge as I can so that you can't see the visible edge, but you don't want to go too close that it's going to interfere when you apply that second coat of resin and it's going to come over the curve of the tile. So just be aware of that. Okay, now those are all applied. Now I'm going to apply the rest of the resin to my other coasters. Again, taking into account that this is a little bit thinner than I normally work with. I'm going to put less on the surface because it's going to spread a little bit further. And it is a little bit worrying because there is a good chance that this could run. So again, the thinner the resin is, the more you can extend it, because when it's thicker, you tend to use a little bit more on each tile. But when it's thin, you've just got to be really careful. I can already see that it's running everywhere, so I'm going to do this one first. And now that the transparency is applied, just want to really carefully go over it so you don't move it too much. Make sure you get all of the sides. Again, if you'd like to see the process that I go through to do the resining, I have a full tutorial called Resin Time on my channel. I'll link it up in the card up on the top corner and also in the description below if I remember. Just make sure that all the edges are down. Now, this one I may need to add a little bit more resin to, because I don't know if you can see, but you can see the edge where the transparency is sitting. So in that case, because this resin is thin, I may need to do a second coat, which isn't a big deal. I'll just remember to thin out the second batch as well, so it's a thin coat rather than another thick coat on top. Now, I did say that I was going to try the printing method, which I've forgotten. That's not going to happen, but basically you would just do the same application, resin all the, cover your coaster in resin, and instead of resining the transparency in, you would apply that last minute on top and allow that to dry. And in that case, I would curl up one corner just so it's easier to remove, and then you can peel that transparency off and leave the ink behind. Again, if you're doing that way, make sure that you've got the ink side facing down. That will be the side that's not shiny and doesn't have any texture of the plastic. And the reason I like this idea, and I've waited so long to share it, is because I wanted to make sure that it looks great, perfect for me to share with everybody, and that I'm confident that it works, and that the designs that you pick will work with this technique as well. So you can see that my silhouette here is a little bit lost because of how dark it is, but when you turn it in the light, you can see that color shift and then you see the silhouette. And that's what I want to do. I want it to be nice and subtle, because at nighttime, you don't necessarily see the trees. You see everything really dark. So a nice dark background works great. Something a bit lighter like these works well also. But you don't want to do this over white, because there's a good chance you'll see the transparency. Again, just going through slowly. This does take a bit of time because you're trying to smooth over the resin on the surface and keep that transparency in place underneath. Now I've kept a little bit of resin in my cup, and I'm going to double check at the end of all of these when I go back over it that there is enough resin on the surfaces. So I'll just divide that evenly, and tomorrow, once these have cured for about 24 hours, I'll come back, double check them, see if they need a second coat. Again, something to watch out for with if you cut these a bit smaller, there is a chance that the transparency will stick up in the center, in which case you may need a second coat. So it's just monitoring it, looking for it, making sure that everything is nicely coated, nicely flowing, and aligned. Once you've got that top layer on, you still go back and align everything. Now I advise doing these, if you're following my technique of applying resin, I advise doing these first before you do anything if you're adding glitter like I do, because I tend to reuse the same resin cup. I don't see a problem with that. You're just mixing resin in resin. And from my experience, it doesn't really affect anything between batches. So if you're doing these first and you're not adding glitter, yeah, best to do these first so that any subsequent batches will have the glitter in it and you're not going to contaminate these with glitter. And you really do have to just check every single tile if you're doing this. You can't just do them all and then assume that they're all the same. Each shape that you cut, the size difference. So if they're sitting slightly up from the edge, you'll be able to notice that because the silhouette won't reach all the way to the edge. Chances are, if your design is going to stick up, you will see it when it's wet. So this is the perfect time to catch it. And for future, I may even make these just a tiny bit smaller, so I'm guaranteed that they're not going to come anywhere near those edges. If you just do decide to use this idea, please tag me online, tag rainandpours, and I'd love to see what you can do with this. It really does open up limitless ideas for our art, and you could do this on posters, you could do this on canvas, you could do this on any sort of artwork that you're applying resin to. You can even do it on resin artwork. So making charms, pendants, things like that, you can apply the overhead transparency into those. And if you really wanted to with those, if you're making coasters, for example, as a resin coaster, I would advise doing the print method. So fill your coaster halfway, put your transparency on top, let that cure, pull the transparency off, and then do your final layer of resin on the back. So you could do so many different things with this. So now that I've poured that on, I'm going to just put a little bit more resin in the center of each of my transparency coasters. And then when I hit this with the heat gun, that's going to spread out to all of the edges and form a nice even coat over the top and nice and... Now I'm going to get down low, check my coasters to make sure that I haven't missed any spots. If I have, I'm just going to put my leftover resin in this cup on here. Set that aside. Now, always cleaning. If you get any resin on the glove underneath, I always clean that off before I touch any of my tools so I don't get resin all over my tools. And then at the end of the day, I'll wipe down the tools as well so that no resin dries and hardens on there. Now the heat gun. Okay, you can see very quick with the heat gun, and I use mine on the maximum setting. And just checking, I can see that all of my coasters have a really nice flat finish. And I've just noticed this one up here doesn't have any resin on the top. I'm going to apply some there. One has a little spot in the middle. This is why it's important to check from a low angle. This one as well. Now what you have to watch out for is if you are spot touching up like I am, that the new resin that you've applied is a different temperature to what is on your coaster already, or on your surface already. So when you go over with the heat, your heat source, either your torch or your heat gun, be aware of that you need to heat that spot just a tiny bit extra to make sure that it flows with everything else. I'm going to get my torch on. And that's how quick it is. Okay, really fast, really easy. And I've got some beautifully coated coasters. So once these are dry, I'll show you what they look like. I'm going to put these on my rack and I'm going to end the video here. Okay everybody, so I'm back. It's been about 16 hours since I poured these. So I poured these 3 o'clock yesterday. It's now 8 o'clock in the morning. And I'm super, super happy with how these have turned out. They worked out so much better than the last batch that I did. So the ones that I have on this tray are going to need a second coat. So I have very, very strict quality control regimes in place here to make sure that every product that goes out is as close to perfect as possible. And these ones just aren't quite perfect for a couple of reasons. So this one is one of the ones with the silhouette in there. And let me try and focus for you. Okay, so this is what I was saying about the transparency causing a ridge in the resin. Because you're physically putting another layer in between the resin and the surface, or the tile on the surface, that gives it a chance to form a bump. So I'm going to apply a second layer of resin on top of this, and that should level out that bump because resin is self-leveling. And you can see how glorious that color shifting chameleon pigment is there. And that is the whole reason I wanted to do this idea, because it doesn't look all that flash from a distance, but then when you pick it up and you tilt it in the light, you can see that color change happen, and it goes from that beautiful first color all the way through to the last. I'm going to chuck a second coat of resin on these. What did I have for this one? So this one, 2 tiny little bubbles here. Where are they? Here on this edge. You can see those there. Normally, those would pass my scrutiny. I wouldn't even give them a second look. This one, however, you can see that little dodgy part there. I must have just skimmed over it when I put the resin down. So that part will definitely have to be filled in because any moisture that gets under there will lift the resin. So I'm going to mix up my batch of resin. I'll apply that and I will show you the final products from yesterday's resin session. So the only reason I'm doing the bubbles on that one is because I have to mix up resin anyway. And the way that I mix up my resin, I know that 3 trays equals 200 mils of resin. So I'm going to only do about 60 milliliters because for a second coat you generally don't need as much. So these two definitely won't take much at all because we're just filling in those tiny spots. I do have to do a full coat. And you know what, I might as well show you exactly what I mean. So I'm only going to mix up about 60 mils of resin. Okay. When measuring smaller volumes of resin, you do have to be quite accurate with your measurement because there is less margin for error. If you're doing mass amounts, you don't have to be as millimeter accurate or milliliter accurate. So for example, I'm doing 60 mils. If I measure 10 milliliters extra of one component, that means I'm out by 1/6. Whereas if I was doing 600 mils and I measured 10 milliliters out, I'm down by 1/60. So just keep an eye on that. I'm not going to time how long I'm mixing this for. I'm just going to mix it until it's clear. Normally it's 3 minutes, but I'm pretty good with the resin. I can see when it's clear, I know when it's mixed. And when it's a smaller amount, it doesn't take as long to mix either. So just make sure that you're always scraping the bottom, especially if your cup has ridges on the bottom like mine do. Now just to show you, I am purposely whipping my resin. Just to show that you can get the bubbles out. No matter what you do, you can always get the bubbles out of your resin as long as you take care of it. So that little bit of heat from the heat gun and from the torch is enough to pop all of the bubbles. So I showed you earlier in the video how the stone coat was nice and thin and those bubbles all dispersed, and you can tell like they're perfectly clear. That resin has no bubbles in it whatsoever, even underneath that transparency, because of all those extra steps that we took. So my method does work. Don't blame the resin. It's something that you are doing. Most oftentimes it's not the products we're using, it's something we're doing. So if you are getting bubbles, if you are getting hair and things, make sure you check your environment, check your process, check everything before blaming the product and calling the company and complaining to the company or complaining online. Okay, so now I have that mixed up, and let me show you how bubbly this is. Like, that's crazy bubbly. It's not even clear anymore. So this is going to be proof that you can fix it. Okay, and when I do the second coat, like I said, I don't need to put as much. I'm only going to put a tiny amount on the back ones and a little bit more on these. And I might as well bring you down for a close-up while I fix these up. Okay. So you can see plenty of bubbles in here. Like, that's not clear at all. I'm going to start at the back and just using the same method, spreading that across the top. And like I said, second coat doesn't have to be amazing. You just want to do the whole process, make sure the whole surface is covered. And the resin should flow a little bit easier because you've already got that other coat underneath. The resin should flow easier because resin's already been there. And because it likes to adhere to itself, it should flow nicely over that bottom layer. So there's our resin coat, and all of those bubbles are gone. Like, just from spreading it out with my fingers, those bubbles are gone. Now you do just want to make sure that you've touched the whole surface with the resin, so that when you do use the heat gun or the torch to heat that up and spread that out, it's going to self-level. Now you can see the transparency a little bit in these. I'm fine with that. It's a design element, and that's something that we have to do to put it in there. The way that you could get around it is by making the transparency the whole size of the top of the tile. But like I discussed earlier, you run the risk of having the edges come up on the edge of the tile. And that's a lot worse than being able to see the transparency, because it makes everything uneven, and you can't often, you might not be able to level that out with a second coat. Now it's 8 AM here. I should be able to come back later on tonight and apply and remove the tape on all of the coasters that don't need a second coat. So I did what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trays of coasters yesterday, so that's 56. Did them in a couple of hours. This technique is really quick. This method is really easy. So yeah, after 24 hours or so, come back, tape all the tape off those, and then tomorrow I'll come and take the tape off this last tray. Okay. So again, take off the double glove. So if you don't know what the double glove is, I literally put 2 pairs of gloves on, one underneath, and I keep the one underneath a little bit pulled down, like this. And then when you need to remove the top layer of resin, or the top glove, all you do is pull that over the top. You're not getting any resin on your hands. Just pull that top one over the bottom one, or the bottom one over the top, and you're not getting any resin on your hands, and nothing's contacting your skin, so it's a lot better for your safety. So just take the heat gun again. And there we go, there is our silhouette coasters done. So again, I'll let these cure and I'll show you the final results. Okay everybody, welcome back. So this is part 3 of the video, or part 4 of the video. I haven't decided if I'm going to show the painting of these first, which I think I may do if I haven't done it already. So now my resin has cured for 24 to 48 hours. So I did a second coat yesterday, so they'll only be 24 hours. But the ones that were fine will have had 48 hours to cure. And I'm going to show you how I take the backs off, how I apply the cork, and how I finish my coasters. So my methods have changed a little bit over the last 6 months. Everything is basically still the same. I've just learned a couple of things to try and protect the finish of the coasters so that they don't dent and mark, because the cork can leave tiny indentations on the surface. Because resin does have a memory, they will eventually even themselves out at room temperature, or you can use a heat gun to try and soften that resin back up, and it should go perfectly smooth again. So I have a whole tray of my finished resin coasters here, and I'm super happy with how these turned out. So let me see if I can get you a close-up here. So this is one with a mountain underneath, and you can see that gorgeous color shifting chameleon pigment up the top, and you can see that silhouette is sitting nicely in there. Now at certain angles you can see the transparency in there. I don't think that's an issue. I'm quite happy with this, and when you're just looking at it normally, you don't see the transparency at all. So it all depends at the angle that you're looking at it. The second method that I described in the video that I didn't end up showing would work much better for this, because you can put the print on top, peel the plastic off, and you won't see any transparency, as that's just leaving behind the ink. So I will do a video in future when I get round to it. So maybe the next time I resin any coasters that I do, I'll do some with the transparency so we can just see how it works. I might use some dodgy coasters that I've got there and just give that a go. So now I'll show you how I take off the backs. So what I've got here is some packing foam. So I get this in a big roll, and it's just that really thin stuff that you'll find wrapped around delicate items. And I've put this down because even the little indentations in the wood on my countertop, so under here, any little bits of dirt, dust, paint, anything that's even slightly raised is going to mar the surface of the resin. So, and because it is still soft, it will take on that shape and those indentations. So what I've got is just this foam, and I did a quick test with this before. The foam doesn't leave any marks on the resin surface, and that's important when we're pushing the cork onto the back of these coasters. So what I do is I pull the plates off the back of all of my coasters that I'm going to do, and these are just the little plastic bowls that I use to hold everything up. I really like them because they've got a really nice wide base. They sit perfectly flat, they're not going to rock or wobble, and this part is also wide enough that it sits in the middle of the coaster, and that's not going to tip if you need to lift it up. And to lift it up, you can grab it from the sides and not have to touch any of the surface. So if you do need to move your resin projects and you don't want to leave fingerprints, that's a great way to do it. So the reason I like the disposable plates is sometimes they will rip. In that case, that one becomes unusable, and I just throw that one out. So after a while, they do get a little bit ratty. You get resin all stuck in the bottom. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can block up your artwork if you're trying to stack them, so it will make them uneven, particularly if you're trying to level out canvases. But other than that, these are good for, 20, 30 uses if you can get that much out of them. Okay, so just before I show you how to remove the tape, we need to prepare a board so I can put these coasters back onto them once they're ready. Now, I use these silicone mats. These are Tersley brand. I got this from Amazon. They're about $8 each from memory. And they are amazing for resin because any bits that come up, literally just pull straight off the surface, so you don't have to struggle and fight against them. So what I do is I just pull up all the big blobs that I can see, and I grab them with my fingers. Then there are some smaller ones that you may not be able to pick up or keep hold of. So I have a trick for that, and I'll show you. I've got two mats ready to go. I have this masking tape. It's Bear brand, it's blue, and it's like a vinyl tape. You could do this with any really, really sticky tape that you have, and this stuff is really, really strong. So what I do is I roll it up into a little ring, put it on my hand, and then I just use that to go around the mat. And because it's silicone, nothing will stick to the silicone, and because the tape is sticky, all of those little dots of resin are going to stick to the tape and come off that mat. Now, you don't ever want to store anything that's resined upside down on these mats, because it does have a microscopic texture in it, and that will imprint onto your resined work. So if you're going to store anything on these after they've been completed with resin, please store them face up so that the resin is not contacting the silicone mat. And there you've got all of those little resin lumps picked up nice and easy, and it didn't take too long, and that mat is now clean, ready to go for another round. So I'm going to put that aside, and this piece of tape, save this piece of tape because it's still got plenty of area that you can pick up all your resin bits with, and that'll last 2 or 3 mats for me. So now I have my coasters here ready to go, and you saw me put this one face down at the start, and just having a look in the light, you can see that it's still perfectly flat, so nothing's marred that surface. So now what I will do is I take my sharp bladed craft knife and I start about 1 centimeter down from the corner, and I'm just pushing down and I'm putting gentle pressure inwards and downwards against the coaster, and I'm getting underneath that tape. And all I'm doing is cutting through the resin, and the resin's still nice and soft, so it's not too difficult. And I'm just putting the blade just underneath the inside surface of that tape. And as it's cutting through the tape, it's cutting through the resin, cutting through the paint, and then I can peel that off in one nice square. And there you go, that's the back of the coaster. So you can see a little bit of paint got underneath there, but once we put the cork on the back of these, you'll never notice it. So I'm going to take the tape off all of these, and I'll be right back. Okay, so those are all done in real time. What was that, maybe 7 or 8 minutes? So not too long at all. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that when you're taking the tape off, it will dull the blade of your knife very, very quickly because you're rubbing the metal against ceramic, and you can buy ceramic knife sharpeners. The reason being is that ceramic is harder than the metal, and so what will happen is it will eventually dull the blade. Let me try and focus on this for you. So you can see I've got tiny little nicks taken out the end of the blade, and the reason I use these long bladed craft knives is because once that starts to happen, I just go as far down as the blade is reaching, and I'll just use an offset pile here. They've got a little built-in mechanism so that you can snap off the blade, and you've got a fresh blade for the rest of it. So that's a really handy tip to save you changing blades all the time. You can just snap off the bits that you don't need. Okay, now these tiles that I have are not actually 10 centimeters across, and I've got hundreds of these, so it's really disappointing. And that means that I have to cut my cork down to size. So I've got my cork backings here. I get these from Amazon, and these are exactly 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So I'll show you an example of how they're different. So this is the tile that I like to use. It's got a pill shape on the back, so you can't really see it because it's taped up. And these are exactly 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So I do prefer to use these over these because with these ones, because they're slightly shorter, I need to cut quite a bit off the sides here to make them fit. So to do that, to make that quick, easy and efficient, I have built myself a jig. So this is just 2 pieces of wood that I've glued together at right angles, and this allows me to cut perfect 90-degree angles every time I need to cut cork for my coasters. I'm just going to slide this up under the bench here, and the way I prefer to do this now is with a rotary cutter. So this is a 65mm rotary cutter that I bought from Spotlight here in Australia, and it might actually be 62mm. And this is the best way that I've found to cut the cork, because it doesn't snag on the edges. So all I do with these is put the cork into the right angle. I know that that is going to be perfectly 90 degrees, and I have kept one of these tiles just blank. I haven't put anything on it, and this is my template. So I put the 2 bits of cork in there, I square up the tile, and once I know that they're perfectly 90 degrees, I just start on the side, pushing firmly down into the cork and cutting those edges off, and you can see how easily that's nice and trimmed, and those are perfectly sized for these tiles. Now, because when you add the paint and the resin, it does make them slightly thicker on the edges, when you go to apply this cork, all you do is take off the backing, which can be difficult sometimes, so you just have to try every corner and try and peel this backing off. Now, these cork backings are self-adhesive, so you don't need to add any glue or anything to them. I really like these ones. And there are hundreds of brands on Amazon. They're all pretty much the same. Go. And I line up this bottom corner and the side and the edge, and all I do is push that down nice and firm. So because these tiles have a lip on the edge, it's really important that you push down firmly all over the back of the tile, especially on the sides, because in the cold, in winter, they do tend to pull up from the edges a little bit as the glue hardens. And if I see any bits that are sticking out from the side, I just run the craft knife over it, or the rotary knife, and there we go, we've got a nicely done tile. Now to finish that up, I'll just show you how I finish that up and then I'll go ahead and do the rest. I take my stamp. I ordered this from Penrith Rubber Stamps here in Australia. I just sent them my design, they printed it up for me. Got my stamp pad, line that up with the center, roughly. It's handmade art, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And then I take my heat gun, and I'll show you why I do this. So if I take my finger and I put it here on the side, you can see the ink comes off onto my finger. If you use a heat gun, you'll heat set the ink and it's not going to come out of the cork. So I'll just quickly do that. Okay, so it only takes a couple of seconds. And you do have to be very careful that you're not doing this over anything plastic, because it will start to curl up like this has happened here. So puppy pads, foam mat, anything like that, I will take these off of the mat before I use the heat gun. So I'll just put them face down on the table, because I'm not putting any pressure on them, it shouldn't mark the surface. Now you'll see if I take my finger, nothing's coming off over that. Okay, so if you're finding that your ink is running or it is coming off onto another surface, use a heat gun to set it, and that should be plenty. And there we have a beautifully finished Sheleeart chameleon coaster. Okay, so there we go. That's our chameleon Sheleeart coaster, all finished, nicely done. And I'm really happy with how these have turned out. So I'll leave these aside face up to cure for 30 days before I put them on my website. And that way the customer doesn't have to worry about waiting for these to cure before they put any hot items on them. So if you're liking what I'm doing here, don't forget to like and subscribe. I really hope you've enjoyed this process and this little tutorial. As far as I know, I've never seen this done before. And if you do this, please tag me, like this video, share this video, and show me what you can do with this technique. I'd love to see how you're using the transparencies or even the print method onto the ink, onto the resin, sorry. I'd love to see how you're using that for your artworks. I've got a lot of plans with this. And you don't have to print just black and white, you can print color as well. Another idea I had was to take some pictures of the cherry blossom trees that are in flower outside my house at the moment, have them printed onto transparencies, and just do a plain white background with the transparency on there. I think that'd look absolutely amazing, really nice and simple. Maybe even include a fresh pressed cherry blossom as well. So there's so much stuff you can do with it, and I can't wait to see what you do with this technique. So I'll see you in the next video, guys. Take it easy. Bye.